Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I am Adil Brar. It's been over a month since India and Pakistan engaged in a very high-intensity conflict that broke out on May 7. Though it's not uncommon for these countries to engage in conflict, but we've not seen this kind of conflict in decades. And one of the new features that we saw during this conflict was Chinese weapons used by Pakistan against India. Did these Chinese weapons really meet the expectations, or did they fall short? And what does this all mean for Taiwan? To learn more, we are going to be joined by Frank O'Donnell, a senior advisor at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network in Washington, D.C. Frank, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be able to speak with you in person.
India and Pakistan recently engaged in a high-intensity conflict with high-technology weapons that only lasted 4 days. What's your initial takeaway about the weapon systems used during this conflict?
What we saw was India and Pakistan deploying what in many ways was their frontline military technologies. With India, for example, we know that Rafales were in the air. This is India's most advanced fighter, which is also requiring more of trans at the moment. And for Pakistan, we know that is JF-17 Block 3 and J-10 fighters, both of Chinese origin, were also in the air. And so it gave India and Pakistan a real opportunity to directly test these technologies against each other in combat. And we saw, casualties in this regard on both sides. But this was also complemented by, in terms of new technologies, the widespread use of drones to conduct many of the precision strikes. And to save these manned aircraft actually from conducting these strikes themselves and placing their pilots at risk.
We saw a lot of fog of war and misinformation being shared by both the sides, and that complicated analysis for many experts around the world. What have we learned about the performance of Chinese weapons supplied to Pakistan?
It would not surprise me if, given the sheer amount of drones that were in the air from both sides, that quite a few would have been shot down by successful air defenses on both sides. So I feel that the air defenses would have had a significant role and a successful role within this broader conflict. They can't stop everything. No air defense system ultimately can, because part of the challenge is what we saw is the ability of these new precision munitions on both sides to evade air defenses, both through, things like maneuverability, but also just through mass in terms of the sheer mass of platforms and missiles that were in the air. So the exact, proportion of missiles, platforms that were brought down by Indian air defenses is hard to quantify. But I think part of the lesson of the conflict, the damage suffered by both sides in terms of military assets, shows how ultimately air defenses can only protect against so much.
So the Indian military claims that they targeted Pakistan's air bases deep inside the country. What's the evidence that has emerged to substantiate the claim?
We can see, for example, damaged runways. We can see damage that was imposed upon some of these sites. One other point I want to raise in this context, though, is again the precision element of this. So India was clearly signaling to Pakistan that we can reach what are your sensitive air bases. And we can, if we want to, inflict more damage if we chose to. So, a pinpoint strike on a runway or a hangar or a certain logistics center shows to Pakistan that, ultimately we can hit anywhere in this airbase if we want to. And this very limited strike here is just to show you that.
Now, India's military says that they intercepted one of fully intact China-supplied PL-15 air-to-air missiles. There are also reports about China's air defense systems not operating as they were expected to. Does this mean that Chinese weapons failed to perform as they thought?
What we can, verify is that there were Pakistan, not just Chinese origin drones, but the JS-17 Block 3 fighters and J-10 fighters in the air. And that also at least one PL-15 air-to-air missile was fired because there is debris from that recovered on the Indian side. There have been claims, for example, that, a Rafale was, or perhaps more several rappels were downed by Pakistan fighters. There is simply not enough evidence in the public domain to confirm that. We do know that a rappel, at least one rappel, came down. We know that these fighters were in the air on the Pakistan side. We know that at least one PL-15 missile was fired. But in terms of the claim we're often seeing that, the at least one rappel being brought down was brought down directly by a Pakistani fighter fielding a PL-15. We just don't have enough public evidence of that. No air defense system is 100% perfect. And for example, some of the platforms that India use, especially the BrahMos missile, is all but unstoppable. And you have to respond to a BrahMos strike really by retaliation than expecting to be able to successfully stop it. The other element of this, of course, is how India and Pakistan and the sites that were struck are very, very close to each other. And so even at the speed of some projectiles like the BrahMos, it is only in the air for a matter of seconds. So very, very little time for even an air defense system to be able to track this and stop it before it's hit, just because of the adjacent nature of these two parties and of the conflict being fought.
So now there are some counterclaims by Pakistan's media. They're claiming that China supplied J-10 fighter jets were used to shoot down India's Rafale jet. What's your take on Pakistan's claim? And did India really lose one or multiple jets?
I think that China will come out of this conflict with increased confidence in the abilities of its military technologies. But it's important not to read too much into that in terms of potential Chinese operations. So conflict gave PLA planners one of the most valuable assets that any military can have, combat experience. The new wave of military technologies, as I mentioned, the Chinese fighters, Chinese UAVs, were tested in real conditions against an adversary fielding its own frontline technology. And not just that, but frontline technologies, many of which were Western in nature. It also enabled China, because these different Chinese origin platforms are in the air or guiding them, to see how, if, again, in real-time combat conditions, these different platforms are used can effectively communicate with each other at a time when the rival is trying to break down these communication links. And this combat experience has been long seen by China's military internally as a sign of weakness against certainly, Western competitors, which have much more relevance, much more experience of engaging in conflicts more recently than China does. On top of this, because of the close China-Pakistan relationship, China will now be able to access just a wealth of sensitive data about Western aircraft vulnerabilities, operational patterns, but also weaknesses in China's own military technologies as they were tested in this conflict. And so the PLA will have increased confidence in those platforms as they were tested in real-time combat conditions in this crisis. But we shouldn't read too deeply into this in terms of making a sea change in, how we should think about the PLA, or how the PLA and China more broadly is thinking about its own military projection. This crisis was ultimately a story of aerial dogfight and limited air missile strikes. And so some of the larger operations that the PLA prepares for are immensely more complicated, both politically and militarily. And the PLA is still undergoing deep reforms. And so we shouldn't infer from this exchange that it is going to essentially solve, or make China feel that it has solved, any of the larger political and military issues it faces with this broader conflict planning.
So I'm here in Taiwan, and many people are interested in learning about the performance of Chinese weapons. What are the direct implications for Taiwan during this conflict?
I don't think it really teaches any new lessons, but it reaffirms existing ones. So the focus on standoff precision munitions, whether it's missiles fired from the ground, whether it is missile aircraft and airstrikes shot from the air, this is what both Taiwan and China expect to be the opening stage of a potential conflict between them, a barrage of precision munition strikes. And so China now has experience, as I say, combat experience, is seeing some of these platforms operating against Western competitors with regard to seeing Pakistan use these against an Indian. So while China will have some increased confidence in the technical abilities of these platforms, now that they were tested in real time, that still doesn't change a lot in terms of broader China-Taiwan Strait issues. It is still a completely different ballgame in terms of a potential Chinese conflict with Taiwan, in terms of just the sheer scale of an operation, the fact that the U.S. would likely become directly involved, and the challenge also of combat arms, which wasn't a challenge that China directly experienced in this conflict here. So it shows that, in terms of, the opening stages of a modern high-end conflict, these precision standoff strikes are going to be something that is focused on at the start, which is, what strategists and policymakers, not just outside of government, have long thought and planned rather and observed. But it doesn't change anything dramatically in terms of the PLA's own thinking or China's own thinking about Taiwan.
So Frank, to summarize it, what are the long-term implications of this conflict for the region?
We have, seen and taken close note of the Modi's statement that Operation Sindoor it's not over, it's not finished, it's still ongoing. And that there is a new premise that if there is some other terrorist attack within India, then India will launch another type of precision strike within Pakistan without the kind of buildup, without necessarily the kind of political outreach to other partners and allies, that it will simply act quickly to punish Pakistan for this. And so that leaves India and Pakistan at a much higher continuing level of military tension than before, because both now have to be ready for this kind of contingency, with increased, alert levels imposed upon not just the Air Force, but ground forces more broadly. It is likely we will see other Indian strikes like this in future. They may not be on the scale of, what we saw, especially toward the end of this crisis. But what ultimately happens is that, the adversary always has a vote, and Pakistan has demonstrated that it can follow suit. So the real challenge is there was, an NSA to NSA back channel throughout most of the conflict. And there does need to be conversations about essentially limiting escalation and understanding around where red lines are. So another type of episode like this doesn't really spin out of control.
Thank you for joining us. It's been great to hear your insights on the show today. This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Start your weekend with a cup of coffee and a moment to reflect on what happened this week.
Hello and welcome.
We've got you covered, from defense and politics to high tech and the arts.
Not just to Taiwan, the whole world is watching.
You make the coffee,
we make the news.
Here's what happened on TaiwanPlus.